So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the second panel of Carl's Inclusion Perspectives webinar series, which has been organized by Carl's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Working Group. I'm Julie Morin, one of the program officers at Carl. Before we begin, please note that simultaneous translation in both French and English is available for this session and can be accessed using the interpretation icon in the bottom right corner of your Zoom window. Une traduction simultanée en français et en anglais est disponible pour cette session et est accessible via l'icône d'interprétation dans le coin inférieur droit de votre écran. I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge that today's panelists and attendees are joining us from the unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples who have lived and worked on this land for millennia and continue to do so today. My home and the Carl office here in Ottawa are built on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. We welcome you to add your own acknowledgements into the chat and to honor and recognize the ongoing contributions of the First Peoples of these lands. I would also like to take this opportunity to go over the logistics for the session. Participants have been muted upon entry. Following this introduction, the chat will be closed until the Q&A period at the end in order to allow our presenters to focus on the discussion. Our presenters will be taking questions at the end, so you're encouraged to type your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Links to the Carl Code of Conduct have been included at the beginning of the chat thread. The organizers of this event are committed to providing a welcoming, professionally engaging, and safe experience. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact a member of the Code of Conduct Committee for this event, whose contact information has been listed in the chat. Links to the slides for this session in French and English are also available in the chat. These include a list of EDI-related Carl initiatives, including details about the upcoming diversity and inclusion study, as well as a list of additional resources panelists will be referencing throughout the session. Finally, note that auto-generated captions have been enabled for this webinar, which is being recorded. Now I would like to introduce our moderator for this session. Maha Kumaran is the Carl Visiting Program Officer for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Associate Librarian at the Education and Music Library of the University of Saskatchewan. Without further ado, I invite Maha to lead the discussion today.
Thank you, Julie. I live and work in Saskatchewan, the Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. However, I'm presenting today from Kelowna, British Columbia, the unceded territory of Seals. I would like to acknowledge and thank the First Peoples of both these lands. I would also like to pay my respects to the hundreds of children whose graves were recently unearthed from both these lands. I want to thank by thanking our attendees for joining this second panel featuring racialized library colleagues, and also thanking our panelists for leading this important discussion today. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to draw your attention to the recent Carl EDI initiatives, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which are listed on the introductory slide. In particular, note that more information about Carl Diversity and Inclusion Study, slated to launch in September, is now available on our website under the EDI page. In addition, I would like to remind all participants that panelists are speaking from their own unique perspectives and experiences. And these viewpoints should not be generalized to represent all racialized librarians. With that, I'll start introducing our panelists. Afra Bolofsky is an associate librarian at the University of Manitoba Libraries and currently leads a team of librarians in her role as head Social Sciences Division. In the work of advancing EDI, Afra has participated in planning and organizing the first ever Visionary Conversations community event celebrating Black History Month at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in 2018. As a member of the Canadian Association of Professional Academic Librarians, CAPL's EDI committee, she worked towards establishing a diversity and equity bursary to assist marginalized LIS and archive students to attend the CAPL 2020 conference. Alan Cho, the next panelist, is the community engagement librarian at the UBC Library. He is a subject liaison for the archival library and information studies. His research interests are in critical race theory in librarianship and racialized librarians in academia. Alan currently serves as a co-chair of the Visible Minority Librarians Network of Canada, VIMLOC. Lei Jin has been working for the Ryerson University since 2003, primarily as the electronic resources librarian. She is also the liaison team lead for the Faculty of Science, Faculty of Engineering, and Architectural Science. She is the co-founder and current president of the Canada chapter of the Chinese American Libraries Association, CALA, and recently elected as a member of the CALA Board of Directors. Lei earned her MLIS from Rutgers University, and she's an avid runner and sometimes a reluctant cook. Cecilia Tellis is the head of design and outreach at the University of Ottawa Library, where she leads efforts to ensure that services and spaces are grounded in user-centered design principles, coordinates efforts to communicate the impacts of the library on student, academic, and scholarly success, and identifies opportunities and develops solutions to ensure that the library is inclusive and accessible. Thank you all panelists for joining us today. We'll start with the questions. Maybe I'll direct this question to Cecilia first. What systems, structures, and policies need to change in order to dismantle racism? In other words, loosely defined, the structure of sustainability for EDI and Canadian librarianship, what would that look like?
Thank you for the question. Before answering, I'd like to just acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from my home in Cantley, Quebec, which is also on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. I'd like to thank the Carl EDI Working Group for creating this forum for us, and also I'd also just like to quickly acknowledge the courage and vulnerability of our Black librarians who spoke at the last EDI Perspectives panel. I thought that was really excellent, and I hope those would who hadn't heard it before would return to that. So the question, which is not an easy one to answer in a short period of time, but I've been thinking about it for a couple of weeks, and I'd kind of like to answer it in by providing a bit of context. The easy answer would be all of them. All of them need to be kind of changed, as most are created to maintain the status quo. Most are created without considering those who have marginalized identities. They have not been created with an equity lens for the most part, but we're seeing more work around this. I know my colleague is going to be touching on some very specific things to say, but allow me to provide a little bit of context in what I've been thinking about. So I've been thinking about lately a lot of equity design frameworks that are coming from community organizations. And one of the links is in the document. So the Creative Reaction Lab, which is a nonprofit in St. Louis, Missouri, has come up with this guide for equity-centered community design. I'd like to just read something that they have said about systems. So they say that the reality of our society is that any system produces what it was designed to produce, unless a stronger force intervenes. So that's important. Therefore, if oppression, inequalities, and inequities are designed, they can be redesigned. So as we strive for human equity, we have to be able to recognize inequity and have the ability to recognize ourselves as designers who have the power to disrupt it. And I love this word designer, which, you know, in your mind, you may think of a fashion designer, a graphic designer, but a designer really is anyone who has the agency to make a decision, however small, that will impact a group of people or the environment. Every decision we make has an impact on equity. And so with that sort of framing in mind, that's how I would kind of approach this question. So us as designers to redesign inequitable systems. Another point I'd like to bring up is something I've actually been a little bit afraid to kind of talk about openly, because I haven't really done so in ever. And so white dominant, white supremacy culture and the characteristics that are embedded in our institutions, right? So if you're not familiar with what a definition of white supremacy culture is, allow me to provide that. And this one's coming from the Center for Community Organizations in Montreal, so another community organization that I've been interested in following. So white supremacy culture is the idea or ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. So white supremacy isn't all of us, it's also in our institutions. It expresses itself interpersonally as well as structurally. So what are some of these characteristics? Once again, there's a link in the document. to read what all of them are. Fear is the number one strategy, something that I had to tamp down today. Sense of urgency, perfectionism, quantity over quality, either or binary thinking, and there's a whole list of other ones, right? And so what I've been thinking about personally is how do I get rid of these within myself so that I can then build a department that doesn't have these characteristics? How do we then build an organization that doesn't have these characteristics, right? It has to start sort of small. So to circle back to your question, I'm usually not very long-winded, but I enjoy providing context. I think we really need to tackle what's at that root of racism within our institutions, first and foremost, assuming that our institutions can acknowledge that racism is there. We are sometimes in places that they are not there yet, and to start shifting that culture. So that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you, Cecilia. I like the idea of designer as well, and having the agency to change is in all our hands, I believe. Thank you for that response. Alan, would you like to take a stab at the same question? Let me know if you want me to repeat that question.
Thanks, Maha. Thanks for this question. I want to also acknowledge that I'm living here and working here in Vancouver on unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. It's a loaded question, Maha, but it's one that I want to tackle. I want to have a few points that I want to elaborate on. One of them is transparency in pay equity, particularly regarding racialized librarians. Now, as librarians, we don't often want to talk openly about pay, particularly the money involved in the dollars and cents. But I want to refer to the article by our colleague Yan Lee at Wilfrid Laurier University, the racial pay gap of Carl libraries, and it's also in the link in the resources. I think this is a really important article. It was published a couple of months ago in college and research libraries, and really I think it's one of the first articles that really acknowledge here in Canada, particularly Carl libraries, the racial pay gap of minority and non-minority librarians. And really, it's much more than just money. It's about acknowledgement, recognition, and equity of the work that we all do. And it's connected to so many other things, but there's little to no transparency around salary, particularly, those when you're hired, how much you're getting, who's getting what, but also means equitable labor. And I think sometimes that if we don't touch on this topic, which is a sensitive topic to many, it deals with merit, promotion, tenure, between non-racialized and racialized librarians, particularly from historically marginalized backgrounds, where we're really doing a disservice to the whole picture and the discussion of EDI. So this was a really important article, and I think that it opens a lot of doors to many discussions that still need to be had. What's really interesting about this article is that it compares to the ARL, our American counterparts. And what Yan Lee has found out in the article and in the discussion is that there has been great strides in the United States in terms of narrowing the gap, but in Canada, not so much. And I just find this to be mind-boggling. This is something that needs to be addressed. I don't look at the Sunshine List in my library like I do in the like the news and look at it every day. But I do notice that there is a gap among my institution. And I use myself as an example. So I think there's lots more research that needs to be done. Another point I want to bring up is diversity. This term diversity has been used so much that it's been diluted over time within the profession. And sometimes it serves as a buzzword more than for actual transformative change. And I worry that sometimes diversity can't benefit just the mainstream minority. And what I mean is that diversity almost becomes commoditized, and it's become measured, assessed, and used to justify existing structures and behaviors that is from the white supremacy culture. And what we're seeing is that we have a revolving door of racialized librarians that are not oftentimes retained in their positions and in their institutions. And there is not enough research, I think, at least in Canada, that touches on this topic. And I think I use Black Lives Matter as a really interesting point. The argument is the system isn't broken because it was built this way. So we've inherited a century of a system without even knowing it, and now we're kind of realizing it. And I think we're really catching up. So that's a point I want to make. And another point I want to make is affirmative action as something that's, we don't talk about here in Canada as much. It's kind of sometimes a taboo subject, but I used the research from Victor Ray, who's a sociologist, and uses this term called racial politics of citation. And he argues that citations are performative. It's not an actual measurement of scholarship. And of course, for academic librarians, we do a lot of research and publish, but you also do a lot of collaborative work as well. And according to CAPL, the census, the most recent census, 90% of librarians, academic librarians, are white. And that's a challenge because there is a persistent ghettoization of race-related panels and discussions on conference programs and agendas. You notice that there's almost citational segregation, which is another term used, meaning there's a preference for citing authors who are members of the same group and resulting from established patterns of racialized professional socialization, meaning that you go into conferences and you look at the agenda and the program, you notice that racial librarians tend to present together and the non-racialized librarians present together. And so you sort of this ghettoization that Victor Ray kind of touches on. And this is predominant in a number of subject areas. Quite recently, communication and sociology are subjects that have touched on this topic. In fact, there's a hashtag for communication called #communication_so_white. And I think LIS has this same situation. So there's a perpetuation of the whiteness of librarianship that we need to get at the heart of, which is a problem. And I'll touch on this a little bit later on in the next topic about the Rooney Rule, because I think that's something that's hasn't been mentioned a lot in Canada and LIS, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on.
Thank you, Alan. 3 main points I got out of this is transparency in all our equity efforts, do not commoditize any EDI work, and avoid ghettoization if at all that's possible. And those are some of the things we can do to change the structure. Afra, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And just before I go, I just also wanted to acknowledge that I'm located in Winnipeg. So that's Treaty 1 land, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I also want to acknowledge that my water is sourced from the Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. So just an answer to the question, or to continue on with what Alan was saying, there's definitely, I think, a lot of critical examination that needs to be done within library structures. I guess I come, more from a practical standpoint. So I guess what I'm thinking of is looking at ways to examine that. So one practical example is to conduct an internal audit on the structures, systems, and policies to identify ones that maybe are problematic, and look at ways to then incorporate more EDI within those policies, as well as coming from more of an anti-racism lens. Just to get, I guess, more specific with that, one area, I guess, that I was thinking of is just looking at hiring policies. So just looking at critically examining hiring policies within academic libraries or libraries in general. I found that there seems to be a tendency to look at hiring internally. Okay, so looking at internal applicants and the hiring of that. So I guess I'm thinking then, as we talk about, creating a structure of sustainability for EDI and librarianship, then we should really ask, ourselves whether internal hires are challenging the status quo. So as Alan has already stated, and this is nothing new. We know that in the CAPL census 2018, that it's clear that there's a lack of racialized librarians or visible minorities librarians, making up around 10% within Canada. And again, if you're to look at academic librarians, that might even be a smaller number. So knowing this, then we should really critically consider whether the practice of hiring internally is one that advances diversity, or is it one that leads to a stagnation of progress on diversity and EDI? So again, this could be extended to, calls for expression of interest. Again, that's another means of restricting the pool of candidates to internal hires. There's a lot of consideration that needs to be given here. Is there a systemic tendency to rely on internal searches and institutions with low levels or very low representation of racialized librarians? And if so, then, how do you move forward in advancing diversity in staffing if this is the case? So again, there's a lot of consideration to be given there. So if there's a question I could put forward, I guess, to library leaders, it's, what opportunities are there to hiring internally with the goal to progress on diversifying the pool of librarians if there are no racialized librarians within the library system? So I'll just leave it with that, something to think about.
Excellent, thank you, Afra. So the major question is that are we challenging the status quo? Are we just doing what we always do? I think that's an excellent question to ask. I think I'll move to the next question. From library schools to candidate presentations to permanent status and promotion, what meaningful changes can our community introduce in 2021 to see the results of a practical strategy to help Canadian academic librarianship attract and retain more BIPOC librarians, the undervalued and the always excluded or almost always excluded librarians? Alan, I'll start with you for this question.
Great. Thanks, Maha. There are a few things I want to touch on. One of them is hiring committees representation. I think Afra has touched on this, but so has Cecilia as well in terms of the design of this. I think hiring committees should have more thought in the process of who sits at the table. There's this metaphor of like who gets a seat at the table. A lot of times racialized librarians do not have a seat at the table, and even if they do, there's no voice there. There's no what you say doesn't really have the same impact. So hiring committees should have a specific person who is from a majority, actually. So I'm flipping it. So from a majority, it's actually pointed to challenge biased behaviors and comments and to ensure that the candidate pool is diverse and push back when it's not. So I believe it's important that it's both work that is from racialized and non-racialized librarians in terms of the thoughtfulness in terms of the community representation. So one of the things that I think is important is that we need to disrupt the common hiring processes that has been really ingrained into academic librarianship, and really cut out the subjective criteria. Like we hear this a lot, like a gut feeling, or is this person the right fit? I remember one time I heard somebody say, is this somebody that I want to have coffee with at the end of the day? So I think that's really challenging for racialized librarians to have the right fit, so to speak. I mentioned this early on, Rooney Rule. I want to leave it to this particular question and elaborate on it more. Rooney Rule was first started in NFL as a requirement, and NFL is National Football League, as a requirement that at least one minority must be interviewed for every senior position. I think this is very powerful. Again, this kind of speaks to this affirmative action that is probably more predominant in the United States. Some companies have begun using this hiring rubric, like Facebook, but I think LIS really needs to think academic libraries in particular needs to institute the Rooney Rule for every position, every major grant, every major conference, keynote, and panel. So it's a whole system that we're thinking about, not just hiring, a hiring process. I think another really important thing is a chief diversity officer in senior administration, not another diversity task force. There's a lot of diversity task force in I think all libraries in one form or another, but actually having somebody sitting at the senior administration table and being able to make decisions, somebody who can develop and promote these programs, and propose organizational goals, recommendations to address diversity inclusion in consultation with library administration and university librarian. A lot of times we hear the answer of, well, we all do diversity. All of the managers do diversity. I don't think it really answers and addresses the heart of the issue, is that nobody's doing it when everybody is doing it. I also think that meaningful change needs to come from our LIS schools. really, really important. I think we need to outreach to undergraduate programs. We have a lot of students from English and humanities. That's great. But are we doing more? I think are the schools actually creating pipelines from undergraduate programs to MLIS programs, and really being able to reach out to diverse populations as well. We're certainly not seeing that. And what I mean is targeting undergraduates of color and disciplines that are reading or research oriented and would help identify students who may be more open to considering a career in librarianship. I think that's something that's been missing, and we've talked about it a lot, and at least in my program when I was in LIS. But are we actually doing it? So I think that needs to be some more thought into that process.
Thank you, Alan. So not only who sits in hiring committees, but what power do they have with others in the system? And obviously, LIS schools need to do more to improve the EDI situation in librarianship. Thank you for that. I think I will ask Lei to respond to that same question. Lei.
Thank you, Maha, for the question and for providing this forum for this important discussion. I would like to acknowledge that my home and my work are here in Toronto and are built on the dish with one spoon territory. So thank you for my wonderful panelists. They've touched on so many important issues and things. And before we have engaged in this question, and I think the EDI working group has a document called Strategies and Practices for Hiring and Retaining Diverse Talent. After reading that document, I thought it answers all my questions and more. It's so comprehensive and it provided so many tools and practical strategies to and to implement policies and in place. But I do believe that there's one essential piece to it that to this question, that to attract and retain diverse talent isn't in essence different from attracting or retaining anyone else. So we need to understand what motivates them, and we need to understand what kind of resources they need, and do we have are we providing them what they need, and are we making any assumptions about how they how would they achieve their success in their career? So what's unique about the racialized librarians is that they thrive in an inclusive culture that welcomes and embraces diversity, and where one could be really comfortable speaking out and just be themselves, and where there are resources available to educate other staff and to support racialized librarians and to implement those policies and procedures. So one of the key factors in this, we have all kinds of policies and system changes in place, but one of the key factors is the human factor. And that's the most subjective factor that could go either one way or the other. It depends on how you see things. And that, Alan has an example for the hiring committee, and Afra also mentioned the hiring process. I think, it all comes down to the actual hiring table when there is actual group of people coming in, and then one or two person dominate the conversation, and they decided that, this is someone that would fit the bill, so to speak. And in other situations, we could have one person, joining the interviewees and just for the sake of diversity, and then being excluded, and because of the lack of common understanding and how truly diversity could bring benefits to the whole organization. I think there's a general awareness of how diversity would benefit, and a genuine understanding of the benefits of diversity that brings more innovation, encourage different ideas to be shared. And that's for the better of the organization. So what I would, what I could bring up as one of the things is we could provide a toolbox to staff to increase the cultural awareness and how different cultures are. Right now we have lots of things in place. Maybe HR has something, programming, training, but it's never mandatory. Maybe it's time to make it mandatory. Maybe we should, force into people's practice. So not to make assumptions about certain culture, a certain way of thinking, and vice versa. For racialized librarians, they need to understand the other side as well. So it's a mutual understanding built on mutual, playing field. So the other thing that I was coming to my mind is to retain a racialized librarian, they need to have a robust support network for them to thrive. So it's networking is it's also based on cultural difference in different cultures. Networking sometimes is less valued in some culture than others. In my personal background, we value more about individual excellence in terms of getting good grades and all that, but networking is never in my upbringing in life until I'm here in Canada. So one of the disadvantages for racialized librarians maybe is the fact that they don't have enough support network as other people. And if there is a robust support network program and reach out to other organizations, for example, the BIPOC, the visual, the Maha is sharing of, and Kala Canada chapter, and the Apala. There's a lot of organizations that are all there to help these organizations, and maybe institutions, libraries could invite those people to their organization, encourage librarians to join them, and to make use of the network that is out there, and together with the internal support network to help retain racialized librarians.
Thank you, Lei, and thank you for the shout out to Carl's EDI hiring document. You can find that on our website and also on the slide that was posted earlier. What I took away from Lei's conversation is to find motivations and resources to help support racialized colleagues. Understand that and remember that human factor is subjective and that we need to make some space for that subjectivity or remove ourselves from that subjectivity, and also possibly creating a toolbox for cultural awareness and possibly making a lot of EDI hiring practices and retaining practices mandatory, if not all of them and most of them. So thank you, Lei. Cecilia, would you like to address the same question as well?
I think what I just wanted to add, and there were so many excellent points already, is that I guess I've personally tried to make my workplace as inclusive as possible, as welcoming as possible. And one way that I've done that is I've been involved in some of the career fairs that we've had in the past couple of years, in the before times, of course. And so I wanted to sort of show my face as a visible minority librarian, that I have made it and you can make it too. And so that idea that I am present and that I am trying to actually, recruit as well. So putting myself in that place has been something that, I guess I've designed as, as an agent of change in my workplace. And so that's something that I've been trying to do on a personal level. And the other thing that I think Lei had actually sort of touched on it is like how, the retaining of BIPOC librarians is something that I've learned about recently is to conduct a staying interview. And so asking those questions to all of your librarians really about like what is going to help you stay, what will retain you, what sort of scaffolding will you need. And so having those conversations and framing it in a way that it's not going to sort of scare away the librarian, like, why are you asking me these questions? But, you know, in a way that is authentic and to really try to understand and empathize with your librarians and to create that scaffolding and that support network that has been discussed. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. So be the person that could be a role model to other EDI librarians who want to come in. I guess that's really important. And also be the agent of change. Even if you're not a racialized librarian, you can be an ally or whatever the new terminology is for that work that you do. So thank you, Cecilia. I'd like to move on to the next question. In the last panel that you already mentioned, Cecilia mentioned the Black librarians, and also in other forums, we've heard about ALA accreditation being an impediment for many librarians, particularly people who come from other countries with library degrees and experience already, but because they're non-ALA accredited degrees, they face a lot of challenges here. What are your thoughts on how we can remove these impediments, whether they're practical solutions? For example, one thing we could do is change the collective agreements, but that is at the institutional level and not always applicable to everybody and not immediately. So what can we do at a broader level? Alan, I'll ask you to go first for this one.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Maha. Very interesting question about requiring ALA accreditation. What's most interesting is that Canada still requires accreditation from the United States. I think that's something that we need to consider. You look at other regulated professions such as doctors, lawyers, dentists, etc., etc. Why are we not using that flexibility that we don't have a regulated regulatory system that we have that we can't often mentor and guide our foreign trained and immigrant librarians and bring them up to speed so that they can start working in our profession. Because oftentimes we need their language and cultural skills and their ideas and perspectives. I think we're so hung up on the ALA accreditation for a number of historic reasons, of course. But I want to return to that idea of we're in Canada. Why do we need the Americans to tell us, what accreditation we need? Of course, the library schools need it. There's some, of course, administrative and bureaucratic reasons for that. But in terms of our academic libraries, and I want to move it also to the public libraries as well. Are there not other avenues for accreditation? Could CARL, for example, be one of the organizations that help develop a Canadian system, a Canadianized accreditation system? So that's something to consider. I think the ALA accreditation has a lot of political implications as well. And of course, Maha, you mentioned the collective bargaining agreements. That's a huge, massive puzzle to dismantle. I think this very question is really, really important in terms of us taking a very closer look at this and how it's actually become an impediment to a lot of talented librarians that have that are not able to become academic librarians because of the ALA. I also want to touch on a colleague of mine at Surrey Public Library that I've actually asked for if I could mention her work, and she before this panel I talked to her and she said yes, because I think her work has been so important in this area for 30 years now. Ravi Bazi, who is the multicultural services librarian, who's now the manager in the division at Surrey Public Library, has been trying to get the local library school to offer online courses for our foreign trained librarians, but to little or no response or any initiative. So Ravi ended up writing her own document on ways that foreign trained librarians could get ahead in Canada, and actually posted it on the Surrey Public Library website for foreign trained librarians. Just navigating the system. What is an ALA accredited degree? I mean, that's a question that a lot of foreign trained librarians might not know once they immigrate to Canada. So she continues to push for action at the BCLA level, British Columbia Library Association level, but it requires a concerted effort. I mean, it's with such a large country, and you need more than just one voice, and she's been doing it for the last 30 years. I also want to touch on Western Ontario that offers the one-year degree program. I think, Maha, you mentioned that as well before. For many years now, foreign trained librarians would take on degreed fast track for their ways back into librarianship, taking that one-year degree, even though they've had previous MLS degree that's not ALA accredited. Well, what this does is an added cost to this. It's not cheap, and it's only getting more expensive. So ALA accreditation actually is a barrier just based on the cost of the degree. And our latest VIMLOC survey that we've been working on seems to indicate there might be a drop in the level of Western grads. Still, it requires a lot of digging and extrapolation of the data. But one hypothesis is that has it outpriced a lot of foreign trained librarians as well. So, there's no easy answer to this. I think it requires Carl and CAPL and LI schools. We all need to come together to help those with experience and skills, but don't have the ALA accepted degree. I think as I said earlier, it requires a concerted effort. Not just one person or one organization can solve this. It requires more voices at the table. I use this metaphor, at the table, that we can all talk together and have the same equity of voice and impact as well.
Thank you, Alan. A lot of awesome points there. Why do we still follow ALA accreditation, and why do we not have some kind of regulation that other fields in Canada, like engineering has PEng and medicine has exams? Why do we not have something like that for librarianship? Excellent points. Lei, would you like to address the same question?
Thank you, Alan. That's excellent points. And I'm all for creating a Canadian version of accreditation. But I'd like to touch on a few maybe practical solutions or suggestions before we get there. I know that's going to be a long process, probably. So in addition to the application, in addition to imagining a applicants reviewing applicants application documents, we might be able to offer multiple ways to supplement those applications. For example, maybe develop a recognized or agreed upon standardized test, or either or a research paper or essay on a certain topic, so that they could make their knowledge of the field be known to the employers. Maybe build a shared database for library schools not included in the current accreditation process or pool, and a shared database that everybody contributed to. This may be naive. I'm not sure how practical they are, but I'm just imagining the amount of the number of library schools in the world out there. Not too many, not too many. So if we can build a database for OUR license database that encompasses 400 databases or 500 databases, I'm sure that we could metadata those key curriculums out there. So another thing that is not completely related, but also just an observation, is that I've personally met quite a few librarians with foreign degrees, and their degrees are more in the technology focus, in programming, human-computer interaction. So more on that, stressing on the technology front, less so in information literacy, critical thinking, research methodology. So maybe those could be considered in designing a accelerated programs to attract people from those places. It's probably also cultural related and historical reasons, but just take a look at the courses at other countries and what's, addressing the root causes, why we don't recognize the accreditation from those countries. What's the difference between the courses that they offer and we offer here? What's the gap between them? So how do we make it similar or make it change to fit into the accreditation criteria here? So that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Lei. So trying ways to level the playing field, either through supplementation programs or tests or certifications, and also creating more courses that are more culturally interesting for some of these librarians, especially those with technology interests or other STEM area interests as well. That's a great point. Thank you. Cecilia, would you like to add anything to this conversation?
I think what I've been thinking about as someone who's been a hiring manager is, and I know that there are a lot of job postings now that do say ALA accreditation or equivalent, which is great. But what do we mean by or equivalent is something that I've been thinking about, and something that I don't think I have yet felt confident kind of doing that sort of like audit and sort of like looking at, okay, they've got this, that's great, but what else do they need, right? And so it kind of also goes back to Afra's point about the hiring, looking at hiring policies and like what are we actually looking for in this candidate? What do we actually need? Can we provide extra scaffolding even if they do not have that ALA accreditation? And so going back to the idea of what other support can we provide? And then who would do that evaluation or that accreditation? So do we need a third party to kind of help us do that equivalency matching, for lack of a better term? So once again, no easy answers, some practical solutions that we've seen, but something that I'm still also questioning. And I think that's going to be important in the next generation of librarians if we want to see some change, right? So
yeah. Thank you. The million-dollar question, what does equivalency mean? And it may change depending on who's proposing it or what they're expecting in their own institutions, I guess. Thank you for that. I think I will move on to the next question. This is about early career and new librarians, because we all started somewhere. How can these early career or new librarians start thinking about librarianship? And we're talking again about racialized librarians who are already facing a lot of challenges. So how can they start thinking about the possibility of leadership? Maybe I'll ask Afra to go first this time.
Great. Thanks, Maha. So for my, I guess, comfortable, for my own comfort, I guess, I'd like to, speak to just my own experience, because that's all I can really speak about. But yeah, I guess I'd like to share, what I've done, because I'm in a leadership role currently. I guess I first want to preface just the fact that, I entered into academic librarianship later in my career. So I actually started in special libraries first. So my experience and, advice would stem from just, again, my experience in the last decade or so being in academic librarianship. But, I guess just looking at my current role in my institution and how I was able to get, to that point, obviously, some things that I've done is, I was trying to be, my own champion. So vocalizing my interest in taking on leadership roles, with my supervisor, my associate university librarian or university librarian. And, there's been a lot of movement at my institution. So it wasn't just a one-time deal. This is something that I had to do iteratively. So just having these types of conversations over a stretch of time. So again, sharing what my interests are. So I'd want to come, with my strengths, experience, and also just, coming with just opportunities that might be available. Just trying to get some insight on that and, what I might want to consider, applying for in terms of opportunities coming up. I also looked at including a goal in my annual performance review of taking on leadership opportunity as well. So just making it clear in my mind, I'm all about visioning and like vision boards and all of that. So putting that in my performance reviews as a goal that I would hope to achieve, so that it's out there for my supervisors and others to see that this is the road that I want to take. But I also back this up by looking at taking on professional development courses. So, you know, either free training courses available through my institution's learning and organizational development office, or looking at courses or events that I could, that are, you know, you have to pay for, but using my professional development fund to attend those. And then as well, on top of that, also just looking for opportunities where I could exercise or develop leadership skills. So, you know, maybe there isn't opportunities currently in your institution, but there are volunteer opportunities for leadership roles in different professional associations. You know, ACRL, CAPL, I was a board member with that. And also just within the libraries, you know, looking at opportunities to lead a working group or standing committee. So, you know, if that's something that's, you know, of interest to you, then I would definitely recommend, you know, looking at taking some of those steps. So, you know, if leadership is something that you'd like to pursue, then look at ways that you can strengthen your skills, again, through professional development opportunities, looking at actual opportunities to chair or to lead a group, or maybe even start one of your own, right? So those are some of ways. And then of course, you know, again, it depends on your relationship with your supervisor, if it's a safe, you know, space and you have that safe space to be able to speak with them, but, you know, sharing and vocalizing what your interests are, that's another way. So those are just some ways that I would recommend.
Thank you, Afra. A lot of great points. Not always easy, especially if you're a racialized new librarian, but be your champion, be your own champion, have iterative conversations, add some of these leadership interests to your annual review processes, and take as many courses as possible. Hopefully you're the kind of person they want to go for coffee with and have that leadership conversation too, right? So thank you for that, Afra. Lei, would you like to add something to that?
Yes, thank you. I'm just looking at this question: how can early career or I'm assuming racialized librarians start thinking about possibility of leadership? And there is an underlying assumption to this question that early career librarians don't think about leadership, which is true in most cases. Why is it true in most cases? Because there are so many barriers in front of them. And it's overwhelming if they, you know, there are lots of professional barriers that requires time to build up experience and expertise, like Afra mentioned. There are a lot of ways to overcome that barrier. And there are gender barriers that we inevitably face. And there is also like cultural barriers, and there's racial barriers, of course. So when you have a new immigrant, for example, first generation new immigrant like me, who may not be familiar with the organizational structure and the culture to begin with, and you have to learn the way little by little. So that all takes time to develop the desire for leadership opportunities. So while we take time to remove those barriers, I like to also mention that, also point out to the definition of leadership. So for the longest time, we have this certain, you know, idea of how a leader should be. You know, we have been treating, you know, soft or personality traits as sciences. You either have it or not. So if you don't have it, then, you know, you're not a natural born leader. Unfortunately, racialized librarians, a lot of them fall into that category because of the nature of because of the cultural reasons, because of the way that they brought up, and because of there's a lot of factors that play into it. And of course, you can still learn your way to become one, but what does this term of concept of becoming mean? That means there is a certain mode that you have to fit in. And that's normally the white dominant definition of what a leader would look like. Like my panelists earlier mentioned, someone to have coffee with. If you don't fit that role of someone who can have coffee with, then you're probably, subconsciously excluded from the leadership role. So just to recognize, maybe there are different leadership styles, and there are ways of being a leader without being too aggressive, without being too, create conflict. So without being challenging all the time, and recognizing that racialized librarians also have some, advantages of contributing to a leadership position. So that would help racialized librarians to recognize their own benefits and be something that they could be comfortable with in moving themselves ahead the ladder, while removing those barriers that are set towards
Thank you, Lei. So there are multiple barriers: professional, cultural. I would even add personality barriers, like extroverted versus introverted. But what is important to remember is that there is a mold right now for who fits into that leadership position, and that mold needs to be broken and examined and rebuilt from EDI perspectives. I think that would be a great idea. Cecilia, would you like to add your thoughts to this?
Just a few thoughts. If I'm picturing an earlier racialized librarian who's in front of me, I would say to first of all believe that you can be a leader, which is hard to believe sometimes if you've had like one management course in library school and you have, sort of fresh out of library school and, just don't have that confidence yet. So build up that confidence in the various ways that have kind of been described already. Job shadowing, something really practical. If you are in a position already and there's someone that you kind of admire their style, if you can build up a relationship with that person and sort of ask them what their day-to-day is like. And so just to start understanding what a leader does and our manager does, I know they're two different things for sure. Something that I'm still doing is I follow people on social media who I admire, in terms of their library research that they do, how they lead. I still building up what leadership means to me, and that has certainly, I think, changed during the pandemic. What is, how do we shift when crisis occurs? How do we shift when there's new leadership at the top level, right? Like change management is a big part of leadership too, right? I just want to quickly shout out that there was an amazing conference last year called the Conference on Academic Library Management. So not necessarily the leadership stream, but I mean management, which is super practical. The acronym is CALM, C-A-L-M, which is lovely. They're already preparing for their 2022 edition, and so keeping an eye out on these conferences that touch on leadership, but this one was quite practical. And then the last thing I'll mention is to start just reading about what a library leadership program looks like. And there aren't a ton out there. There aren't a ton, sadly, and I'll touch on that in the last question. But to start thinking about what do these look like, just to sort of plant that seed. And so once you progress in your career, you can be prepared to apply, prepared to ask for that money, prepared to ask for that funding from your supervisor, to start planning ahead for those opportunities. I love that we've been bringing out that idea of advocating for yourself. That's really, really important. And so I think just knowing what's out there and thinking about it is just something that I'd like to add.
Great. Thank you, Cecilia, for reiterating about being our own champions for sure, but also multiple ideas like job shadowing and leadership conferences, possibly leadership workshops. I would also add, look for allies in your own institution, but also outside your institution. They exist, they may not be other racialized librarians. There are few of those as well, but they may also be from the white culture who will be your true allies and help you move upwards if that's where you want to go. Thank you. I'll move to the next question. What advice would you give library leaders who want to mentor mid-career BIPOC librarians towards leadership positions? So this is advice to library leaders who want to mentor mid-career BIPOC librarians. Lei, maybe I'll start with you for this one.
Sure. So it all comes down to the same question, same statement that I have made before, that what motivates them, what resources that they need, and what kind of support they need. I believe the mid-career racialized librarians are somewhat settled in their position, and they're somewhat comfortable. And now they probably are start thinking about leadership roles. So I believe one thing that leaders haven't been doing so much is giving feedbacks that are constructive and honest. What I can see, the leaders are so polite. They don't normally provide the feedback they probably need to improve what they have been doing. They may not realize that some of those things could be addressed in different ways. And we're just being too polite to point it out and how to improve them. It's the focus on their strengths and encouraging them and singling out the characteristics that are not necessarily that of a leader, or recognizing different leadership styles. That's, I've mentioned before. So those are all things that the leaders could potentially think about, and provides them with the resources. Afra was mentioning the workshop opportunities. There's leadership programs that are all there, organized by different organizations. And so those are the thing. One thing that I also want to mention is the mentorship program. And they might want to set up a mentorship program at their own institution, or reach out to other mentorship programs that are hosted by other institutions or non-for-profit organizations. Those are excellent resources. Some of the feedbacks that you probably haven't been getting from your own institution, you might be able to have something, honest feedback from your mentor. Being one-to-one on that intimate relationship with the mentor could really open things up, and could really, give you really practical suggestions on how to improve yourself, and to consider the next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Lei. I'm watching the time, so I'll just ask Cecilia to go next.
Sure. I'll maybe just quickly mention that if somebody wants to mentor a mid-career librarian, to recognize that we come with a lot of expertise already. For some of us, it's some of our second or third career, and so recognizing the experience that librarian brings and will bring to the mentorship relationship. And also maybe just mention the idea of vulnerability. And so being vulnerable and sharing, within whatever boundaries you need to sort of set up, some of your moments of failure, some of your aha moments, some of those moments where you had your own doubts. I think creating that vulnerable kind of relationship is important in mentoring. And then maybe just lastly, make sure you have the time and energy to put into that mentorship relationship, and kind of question why you're doing it, right? I think that's kind of important as well. Don't just do it because you think I need to do it. Kind of invest in that relationship and make sure that you want to be there, is what I would add.
Thank you, Cecilia. Afra, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, not much more. I guess kind of like what Cecilia and Lee said. I guess I feel like it needs to be, I guess, intentional. So it's something that you don't go in half-hearted. You need to fully go in committed. And I'm a believer in action-orientedness. So just ensuring that that there's benefits, I guess, for the mentees. So looking at opportunities that are both inward facing, so within the libraries, but also outward facing. So again, I think it was touched upon a little bit, looking at professional development opportunities. I know Yetta Jones and Associates, ACRL, they have a number of leadership institutes. I think Cecilia, you kind of touched upon those. So there definitely are like opportunities that library leaders could share with mid-career BIPOC librarians if they are interested in having those leadership positions. I guess it's just good to also just ensure that this is something that's of interest to these mid-career librarians in the first place. So having those conversations, I think, is very important, and just ensuring that everyone's on the same page in terms of what the interests are and that type of thing, so that this isn't something that's kind of being done one-sided, but both people are committed to the process and interested. So I'll share that.
Thank you. Alan, you're on mute.
Thanks, Maha. I'll just go very quickly here. I agree with the idea of my panelists about intentionality. It's really important not to do it half-heartedly. Just after watching this panel and say, oh, I gotta go off and I gotta mentor a BIPOC librarian. It has to be more than that. I think leaders can be role models. I think it's the impact and change that you can have in the profession and the legacy you can leave, I think is immense if you do it the right way. And what I mean by that is really starting small and really checking yourself. And we've mentioned earlier on about checking yourself when you're thinking about culture fit or gut feeling about a candidate when you're evaluating a job, or selecting somebody you want to mentor as well, is trying to learn more about your unconscious bias. And I think checking the word diversity and check it out, because I think that diversity is used too often as a catch-all. So I think for library leaders, it's a great opportunity to learn more about anti-racism, about decolonizing the profession, is learning from a lot of the literature, but also from speakers and leaders in this area as well, and really trying not to perpetuate the bias and the whiteness in librarianship. I think that itself is really important in setting the intentionality of why you actually want to mentor mid-career BIPOC librarians.
Thanks, Alan. Intentionality and proper matching of the mentor-mentee, and also knowing whether or not that person wants to be trained to be a leader. All those things are important points. I'll give Cecilia the last question, and I'll give you about 2 minutes to answer that. I know it's very difficult, Cecilia. What advice would you give Canadian library leaders to do starting right now?
So Alan already touched on it, that idea of that deep reflection, sort of at an individual level of your leadership style, but also your leadership team, thinking about your power and the privilege that you hold. I will lastly maybe quickly mention that I am in the ARL Leadership and Career Development Program, which has really been quite a transformative program for me. It took me a while to kind of believe that I could even be in the program, or that I deserved to be in the program. I knew about it for a couple of years. I finally applied, was, deeply grateful to be, accepted, and that my institution supported me in that program. But it's sad that we don't have anything sort of equivalent in Canada. And I don't know of many other sort of programs that are built for racialized librarians, by racialized staff and librarians. It's just a really unique program, and it would be amazing to build something similar, to build this generation of other of racialized library leaders in Canada, because we have a very unique and different situations then and environments that aren't comparable to the US. And so that's something that I would really love to see. If I need to help build it, I will do it. But that's something I would just want to share.
Thank you, Cecilia. So we need a Canadian LCDP, similar library leadership program in Canada. And for those of you listening, Cecilia has already volunteered to help out as well. Thank you all so much for the prepared questions and your responses to my prepared questions. I have a few questions in the chat and I'd like to throw them out. I'll start with a direct question to Cecilia first, and it's about the staying interviews that you mentioned. So I have a question from John Guy saying, I'd love to learn more about implementing such a thing. Do you think this would be part of an annual performance appraisal meeting where we talk about work career goals, or would it be better to have a separate conversation like one-on-one meetings?
It's a great question. Thank you, Jen. I really literally just learned about them a few weeks ago, and I believe it's been framed as something that would be better done during the annual review process. But I would love to hear a perspective from someone with an HR background. I think it also may maybe depend on the culture of your institution as well, and your relationship with that employee, right? If you're used to having conversations about their career development, then maybe it'll make sense to kind of insert some of those questions throughout your conversations. But at the same time, perhaps it takes those questions maybe provided in advance, and so that individual can sort of start thinking about their answers and have a more kind of informal conversation. So I don't have an exact answer for you, and that might depend on the context.
It's certainly different from an exit interview where it is too late. So you want to have a staying interview to retain that librarian. Yes, thank you. So another question is about how racialized librarians maybe at times be afraid of speaking their minds because it might sound like they're being negative. So the question is to the head, chairs, deans, university librarians listening to this conversation. What can you tell them about the value of listening and providing these racialized librarians with the same preferential treatment that white colleagues at the institutions are given despite them having lesser expertise? Who would like to tackle this question? I think all of you mentioned something along these lines when we talked about early career librarians and new librarians and advice to library leaders. But if there is a situation where you think your white colleagues are preferred, even when they have lesser experience, what would you tell your leadership in library to focus on, to look at your racialized librarians? What kind of advice would you like to give? But what would you do in that situation yourself if you were in that position? I know we tend to hire in the likeness of ourselves. So if you're a racialized librarian, maybe we would do that. But if you're the opposite of that, then what would you do?
Maybe I'll tackle this question, but I'll tackle from the other way in terms of what would I do if I were a leader and was approaching the situation. I go back to the metaphor of the seat at the table and having equitable representation in decision making. It's a lot of times at the seat of the table, who gets invited is challenging. Even if you invite racialized librarians, they might not have the voice that they thought that they would have. So it's intentionality, again, going back to where intentionality is designing the process in which there's racialized librarians have the opportunity to voice their thoughts in this. And a lot of times it's like who can speak the loudest oftentimes gets the last word. I think that we need to flip that around and allow different approaches to communication. And I think this will be a big step in terms of disrupting the perpetuation of the whiteness of libraries. And I think that's how I approach it for one way.
Thank you, Alan. Lei, did I see your hand go up?
Yes, I did. So I just wanted to go back to the point that first of all, the leaders have to acknowledge that they are given preferential treatment to the white colleagues, and recognize that there is some unintentional or unconscious bias that has been happening. So that needs to be addressed first. Then we'll think about the value of listening and providing them with the same preferential treatment. And one thing I'd like to mention is that maybe we could use objective skills data to identify high potentials, to deploy talent, and to improve performance, and facilitate career progression instead of relying on subjective assessment that have bias embedded in them. So maybe that's some way that we could improve on, and we could open up when there is a likely candidate that you would have to mentor, or an unlikely candidate that may not be in your consideration, but you might want to just do that extra mile to maybe talk or having a conversation and find out the value and find out what the racialized librarians could contribute in this regard.
Great, thank you. There's another question about the hiring of the internal candidates, and I think Cecilia mentioned this, but feel free, whoever wants to jump in. I was wondering if anyone can comment about how to deal with it if you were an outside POC librarian hired over an experienced internal candidate, especially in a competitive job environment. I'm guessing they mean experienced internal POC candidate. So do you have anything about that?
I don't think it was me who mentioned the internal hires, but I can understand that could be a really difficult situation to be in, to be seen as the diversity hire. Really, really hard. I think it comes down once again to culture, and hoping that culture is ready to accept and support that person of color librarian, that racialized librarian. I know it doesn't answer exactly the question and how that person as a racialized librarian would survive and thrive in that situation. I saw something the other day, probably on social media, and the question was like, when you're in the interview process, to ask questions about what is the work climate like? Have there been red flags already raised in that culture? And so if there have been, so maybe you should probably take a step back and say, do I want to put myself in that place? Will that cause me harm? So it doesn't quite answer the question, but I hope it provides a little bit of thinking about that difficult situation of being seen as the diversity hire. It's, yeah, striking out that phrase, I suppose, as well.
Well, thank you, Cecilia. Alan?
Yeah, I'd like to touch on this question. Really good one. I think I'll come at it from the point of the institution. I think it comes back to the idea of retention and setting up for success. It's really important to retain your BIPOC librarians, and if you have one that's hired, regardless of if it's internal or not internal, but if it's a BIPOC librarian, it's important to have them with intention of succeeding. I'm seeing recently there was a position posted for only racialized librarians could apply for this position. It's wonderful. I think it's great for equity and diversity inclusion. but is this position set up for success once the candidate fills the position? So I think this is a really important point. Goes back to a lot of our previous discussion about unconscious bias and how can we implement this at the institutional level, whether it means more practical level, having this candidate in the right committees, setting them up for success in terms of a real direction in terms of where their career will progress. You're not just putting them into the position and just letting them sink or swim. Is really having the guidance towards that. I think that we really need intentionality in terms of setting them up for not only success but sustaining them throughout their career as well in that institution.
Go ahead, Afra.
Yeah, no, I just want to add on that because that's a really great point, Alan, that you brought up. And yeah, I would think too that, again, coming more from, I guess, the search committee or the library leaders. So looking at, I guess, setting up networks of support for these types of positions, ensuring that there is a mechanism for feedback and assessment just to see how things are progressing in that role as well. Because yes, it's definitely problematic if you're just kind of dropped into something and there's no support or resources to help you, and you're seen as kind of like a token hire. That's very that would be very uncomfortable. So definitely, I think that there's definitely things that can be done within the institution to support these types of hires and these types of individuals, racialized persons in these roles. So I would hope that people are listening to this and they're looking at ways that they can to take this on to make it a much more smoother transition for individuals, and ensuring too that the leadership is involved in this as well, right? So not just maybe the direct supervisor, but leadership at the higher level within the library is involved to make sure that the transition is working and going smoothly.
Great, thank you. One last question, if you can quickly address this to keep up with our timing. It's from Sandra, and she says, I think too that good representation in our field would naturally lead to more rigorous publication, which I feel is important as part of our professional development, especially in academic library settings. What do you think about that? This is to do with increasing the underrepresented, under-included and undervalued colleagues so that rigorous publication happens from multiple perspectives.
Maybe I'll take the first stab at this question. It's a really good one. Looking at it from a more conceptual sort of approach is that I think LIS and librarianship has struggled with the identity crisis for many, many years now. I think part of the reason for that is the lack of diversity and, of course, racialized librarians. And in terms of the research that comes out, I think when a profession does not have the representation of diverse voices, particularly reflecting the community that we're in, it'll struggle. And I think that you're seeing what we've seen in LIS is a perpetuation of the whiteness of research. As mentioned earlier on, there's the ghettoization of citations, and its impact of it is also into the workplace of who gets invited to give research proposals, presentations, and without that diversity, we don't have the gene pool is only so small, and it replicates itself and it can't grow. And I think that is part of the reason for some of the questions of what is LIS and where are we heading? So a lot of these questions.
It goes back to the systems and structures and revisiting all of them from multiple perspectives through mentoring and leadership and publication and EDI perspectives as well on top of that. So I think we're almost running out of time, so I'd like to thank you all panelists again and all the attendees in the session today and for your great questions. To summarize, I think we talked about the importance of networks, mentorship, leadership training, and the identity crisis that exists in Canadian LIS, particularly right now, that needs to be broken and rebuilt to meet the needs of today's librarians, and particularly from a Canadian perspective and an EDI perspective. That's something for the leaders and the library shakers and movers to take away today. For the racialized librarians, I think it's very important to remember that you can be your own champion. Do what you need to do. If leadership is of interest to you, then find things that you can do, believe in yourself, and be a role model. With that, I will pass the buck along to Julie again, who will conclude us today. Thank you again.
Thanks, Maha. So on behalf of Carl, I'd like to thank our presenters for leading this great discussion and all of our participants for attending. We ask that you keep an eye out for upcoming webinars in this series. We are planning a potential fall panel featuring Indigenous library colleagues. As mentioned at the beginning of the session, Carl is also organizing a diversity and inclusion study, which is currently scheduled to launch in the fall. So more information on all of these initiatives can be viewed in the slides, which have been included in the chat, or on our website at carl-abrc.ca/EDI. Thanks again and have a great week all.